Let yourself settle in comfortably as we journey back over 2,000 years to the dusty arenas of ancient Rome, where men fought and died for the entertainment of thousands. Close your eyes and breathe deeply as we explore the world of the gladiators, warriors who were simultaneously the most despised and most celebrated figures in Roman society, slaves who became legends, and fighters whose names echoed through the Colosseum long after their blood had soaked into the sand. The word gladiator comes from the Latin word gladius, which was the short sword used by Roman legionaries and many gladiators in the arena. This etymology is fitting, for the gladiator's identity was inseparable from his weapon, his skill in wielding it defining whether he would live or die. But the origins of gladiatorial combat stretch back even further than Rome itself, to the Etruscan civilization that inhabited the Italian peninsula before Rome's rise. The Etruscans practiced a funeral ritual in which captives or slaves would fight to the death at the tomb of a deceased nobleman, their blood serving as an offering to honor the dead. This practice, called munera, meaning duties or gifts, was adopted by the Romans around 264 BC, when the sons of Junius Brutus Pera held funeral games featuring 3 pairs of gladiators fighting at their father's funeral in the Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market. What began as a solemn religious ceremony would evolve into the most popular form of entertainment in the Roman world. Breathe slowly now as we consider how gladiatorial combat transformed from private funeral rites into massive public spectacles. As Rome grew in wealth and power, the scale of these games expanded dramatically. Politicians discovered that sponsoring gladiatorial games, called munera, was an effective way to win public favor and votes. By the late Republic, ambitious men like Julius Caesar staged games featuring hundreds of gladiators, turning the arena into a tool of political advancement. The games became so elaborate and expensive that laws were eventually passed limiting how much could be spent on them. Though these restrictions were frequently ignored, what had once been a tribute to the dead became a display of power, wealth, and the might of Rome itself, with emperors using gladiatorial spectacles to demonstrate their generosity and to keep the masses entertained and distracted. The famous bread and circuses that kept the Roman populace content. Let your mind drift to the Colosseum, the most famous arena in the ancient world, though gladiatorial combat had taken place in various venues for centuries before this magnificent structure was built. The Colosseum, originally called the Flavian Amphitheater, was commissioned by Emperor Vespasian around 70 to 72 AD and completed by his son Titus in 80 AD. This massive elliptical structure could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators who were seated according to their social rank. Senators and nobility in the lower sections closest to the action, with the poorest citizens in the upper reaches. The arena floor itself, where gladiators fought, measured 287 feet long by 180 feet wide and was covered with sand, which gave the arena its name. Arena comes from the Latin word harina, meaning sand. The sand served a practical purpose. It absorbed the blood spilled during combat. Beneath the wooden arena floor lay a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical elevators called the hypogeum, where gladiators, animals, and props waited before being raised to the surface through trapdoors, creating dramatic and surprising entrances that amazed the crowd. Now, breathe deeply and picture the men who became gladiators, for they came from various backgrounds. Though most shared the common bond of having lost their freedom, the majority of gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war captured during Rome's countless military campaigns across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. These men were purchased by lanisti, the owners and trainers of gladiator schools, who saw them as investments to be trained and, if they showed promise, preserved for future profitable appearances. Others were criminals condemned to the arena as punishment, forced to fight without training or proper equipment, essentially serving as human sacrifices in the most brutal spectacles. However, not all gladiators were unwilling participants. Some were free men who voluntarily signed contracts to become gladiators, surrendering their freedom and legal rights in exchange for the opportunity to earn money, gain fame, and experience the addictive thrill of combat. These volunteers, called auctorati, took an oath called the Sacramentum Gladiatorum, swearing to endure branding, bondage, and even death by the sword. Let yourself relax as we explore the gladiator schools, called ludi, where these fighters underwent rigorous training that transformed them from slaves and criminals into skilled warriors. The largest and most famous gladiator school was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, located near the Colosseum and connected to it by an underground tunnel that allowed gladiators to enter the arena without passing through the city streets. These schools were part prison, part military barracks, and part training facility. Gladiators lived in small cells, often chained at night to prevent escape or suicide, and spent their days training under the watchful eyes of doctors, former gladiators who had survived long enough to become instructors. The training was intense and specialized, with different types of gladiators learning specific fighting styles and weapons. Trainees practiced with wooden weapons against training posts, sparred with each other using blunted weapons, and studied the techniques that might keep them alive in the arena. Despite the brutal conditions, gladiators received relatively good medical care and nutrition. They were valuable property, and keeping them healthy and strong served their owners' financial interests. Breathe slowly and contemplate the various types of gladiators, for the arena featured specialized fighters whose different equipment and fighting styles created varied and dramatic matchups. The Murmillo was heavily armed with a large rectangular shield, a visored helmet with a distinctive fish-shaped crest, an arm guard on his sword arm, and a shin guard on his left leg. The Thraex, or Thracian gladiator, carried a small square or rectangular shield and a curved sword called a sicca, along with protective padding on both legs and a helmet with a griffin crest. The Retiarius was perhaps the most distinctive. He fought with a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger, wearing minimal armor with only a shoulder guard on his left arm and no helmet, relying on mobility and range rather than protection. The Secutor, whose name means pursuer, was specifically designed to fight the Retiarius, with a streamlined helmet to prevent the net from catching on it and heavy armor to protect against the trident. These different types were deliberately matched against each other to create interesting tactical contrasts: speed versus strength, armor versus agility, different weapons requiring different strategies. Now let your thoughts drift to a typical day of games, which followed a structured program designed to build excitement throughout the day. The morning typically featured venations, staged hunts where trained fighters called bestiarii battled exotic animals brought from across the empire: lions from Africa, bears from the European forests, elephants, leopards, crocodiles, and many other creatures. These spectacles demonstrated Rome's dominion over nature and its far-reaching power. At midday came the Noxii, or executions, where condemned criminals were killed in various ways, sometimes forced to fight each other without weapons or training, other times attacked by wild animals, or occasionally executed in elaborate theatrical reenactments of famous deaths from mythology. The main gladiatorial combats began in the afternoon, when the crowd was largest and most excited. These contests were announced by heralds, and gladiators entered the arena in a procession, parading before the crowd before the serious business of fighting began. The combat itself followed certain protocols and rituals that distinguished it from simple slaughter. Gladiators would salute the sponsor of the games and the emperor if present with the famous phrase Ave Imperator, Morituri salutant. Hail, Emperor! Those who are about to die salute you. Though this phrase may have been used less commonly than popular culture suggests. Pairs of gladiators would be matched by skill level and experience to create fair and entertaining fights. When a gladiator was wounded and could no longer effectively fight, he could appeal for mercy by raising a finger. The exact gesture is debated by historians. The decision of whether he would live or die rested with the sponsor of the games, who would consult the crowd's reaction. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture is likely a Hollywood invention. Ancient sources suggest various hand signals were used, but their exact nature remains uncertain. If mercy was granted, the defeated gladiator would live to fight another day. If not, his opponent would deliver the fatal blow, and attendants dressed as the Etruscan death demon Charon would strike the corpse with a hammer to ensure death, while others dressed as Mercury would use a heated iron rod to test for signs of life. As you rest, imagine the roar of the crowd echoing through the Colosseum, the clash of sword on shield, the desperate struggles in the sand, and the strange world where death was entertainment, where slaves could become heroes, and where the line between glory and oblivion was as thin as the edge of a gladius. Let your breathing slow as we explore the lives of gladiators outside the arena, for their existence was more complex than simply fighting and dying. Successful gladiators who survived multiple combats could achieve a form of celebrity status that seems paradoxical given their slave status. Romans were simultaneously repulsed by and fascinated with gladiators. They were considered infames, people without honor or legal standing. Yet popular gladiators had devoted fans who followed their careers, collected merchandise bearing their images, and even wrote graffiti celebrating their victories on the walls of Pompeii and other Roman cities. Archaeological discoveries at Pompeii have revealed graffiti proclaiming fighters like Celidus the Thrax, the delight of the girls, and Crescens the Retiarius, the girls' idol and healer of their wounds. Women of all social classes, including married noblewomen, were rumored to have affairs with gladiators, scandalizing respectable society but demonstrating the magnetic attraction these dangerous men held. Now, let your thoughts drift to the concept of the gladiator's earning potential and path to freedom. While most gladiators died young in the arena, those who survived multiple fights began to earn money from their appearances. A portion of the fee paid to their lanista would go to the gladiator himself, allowing successful fighters to accumulate savings over years. After surviving a certain number of combats, often around 30, though the exact number varied, a gladiator might be granted a ludus, a wooden sword symbolizing his retirement and freedom from the obligation to fight. Some retired gladiators became trainers at gladiator schools, passing on their hard-won knowledge to the next generation. Others became bodyguards for wealthy Romans or opened businesses using their fame and savings. The ludus was the ultimate prize, representing not just freedom but survival against overwhelming odds, proof that a man could face death dozens of times and still walk away with his life and liberty intact. Breathe deeply and picture the gladiator's diet, which was surprisingly specific and carefully regulated. Gladiators were sometimes called hordearii, meaning barley eaters, because their diet was heavily based on barley and beans, foods high in carbohydrates that would build bulk and provide a layer of fat over their muscles. This subcutaneous fat served a practical purpose. It made for more dramatic but less dangerous wounds in the arena, as cuts would bleed spectacularly but were less likely to reach vital organs or cause immediate death. Gladiators also drank a tonic made from plant ash that provided calcium to strengthen bones. This specialized diet, while not luxurious, was more abundant and reliable than what many free poor Romans ate. Analysis of gladiator bones found in ancient cemeteries shows that while these men suffered tremendous trauma from their fights, they were generally well nourished and received medical treatment for their injuries, at least until their final fatal bout. Let yourself relax as we explore the medical care gladiators received, which was remarkably advanced for the ancient world. The most famous gladiator physician was Galen of Pergamon, who served as doctor to the gladiators in his home city before becoming physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Galen gained his extensive knowledge of anatomy and surgical technique by treating the wounds of gladiators, observing their injuries, and developing methods to clean wounds, prevent infection, and repair damaged flesh and organs. He called gladiator wounds windows into the body because they allowed him to observe internal anatomy in living patients. Gladiator physicians used various techniques, including cauterization to stop bleeding, suturing for deep cuts, and herbal preparations to reduce inflammation and fight infection. The fact that some gladiators survived dozens of fights is testament to both their skill in minimizing wounds and the effectiveness of the medical care they received. Now breathe slowly and contemplate some of the most famous gladiators whose names have survived from antiquity. Spartacus is undoubtedly the most renowned, though he is remembered not for his arena achievements, but for leading the greatest slave revolt in Roman history. Spartacus was a Thracian who had served in the Roman army before being enslaved and sent to a gladiator school in Capua. In 73 BC, he and about 70 other gladiators escaped, armed themselves, and sparked a rebellion that grew to include tens of thousands of escaped slaves. For 2 years, Spartacus's rebel army defeated multiple Roman legions, terrorizing Italy before finally being crushed by the forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus in 71 BC. Spartacus himself died in the final battle, and 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to any who would dare rebel against Rome. His uprising demonstrated that gladiators were not merely entertainers, but dangerous trained fighters who, if organized and led effectively, could threaten Rome itself. Let your mind drift to other famous gladiators who found glory in the arena rather than in rebellion. Flamma was a Syrian gladiator who fought an astonishing 34 times, winning 21 of those contests, with 9 draws and only 4 losses. Most remarkably, he was offered the ludus, his freedom, for times, and each time he refused it, choosing to continue fighting in the arena. His tombstone, discovered in Sicily, records his unusual career and his decision to remain a gladiator until his death at age 30. Priscus and Verus were 2 gladiators who fought each other in a legendary bout during the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 AD under Emperor Titus. According to the poet Martial, who witnessed the fight, these 2 men battled for so long and with such skill and courage that neither could gain advantage over the other. Finally, both men simultaneously signaled their submission, and Emperor Titus, moved by their valor and the crowd's enthusiasm, granted both fighters their freedom, a rare instance of a draw being recognized and rewarded with the ludus for both combatants. Breathe deeply as we explore the gladiatorial subculture and the bonds that form between these men who lived and died together. Despite being slaves and social outcasts, gladiators developed a fierce camaraderie within their schools. They were organized into families or groups, and often formed associations similar to modern sports teams, with their own burial societies that would ensure proper funeral rites for fallen members. Gladiators created a culture with its own values, hierarchies, and traditions. Veterans commanded respect from newer fighters, and different gladiator types developed rivalries and traditions. Evidence suggests that gladiators sometimes formed romantic partnerships with each other and maintained these relationships within the confines of their schools. The oath they took bound them together in shared fate, and inscriptions on tombstones sometimes reveal that surviving gladiators paid for the burial of fallen comrades, honoring them as brothers in arms despite their low social status. The relationship between gladiators and Roman religion was complex and significant. Before combat, gladiators would often pray to various gods for protection and victory. Mars, the god of war, was an obvious choice, but many gladiators also appealed to Nemesis, the goddess of revenge and fortune, who was thought to govern the unpredictable outcomes of arena combat. Some gladiators wore amulets or charms for protection. After a gladiator died in the arena, his blood was considered to have special properties. Some Romans believed that drinking a fallen gladiator's blood could cure epilepsy, and fresh gladiator blood was collected and sold for this purpose, though physicians like Galen condemned this practice as superstition. The gladiator's sword was also thought to have power, and some women would use a gladiator's weapon in wedding ceremonies, believing it would ensure fertility. These beliefs transformed the gladiator from a mere entertainer into a figure with almost magical significance, someone who existed at the boundary between life and death, and whose proximity to mortality gave them a kind of sacred power. As you sink deeper into rest, picture the contradictions of Roman society, a civilization of law and philosophy that made a spectacle of death, an empire that saw strength in military discipline, yet celebrated the defiance of individual gladiators, a culture that despised these fighters as the lowest of the low, yet could not look away, could not stop watching, could not help but wonder what they themselves would do when facing death in the sand. Let your breathing deepen as we explore the concept of Munera Sine Mission, games without reprieve, where defeated gladiators would not be spared regardless of how well they fought. These particularly brutal spectacles were rare and controversial even by Roman standards. In typical games, the sponsor had the option to spare defeated fighters who had shown courage and skill, preserving them for future entertainment and protecting the investment their owners had made in training them. However, in Munera Sine Mission, every fight ended in death, creating an atmosphere of desperate savagery that some Romans found thrilling, but others, including emperors like Marcus Aurelius, found distasteful and wasteful. These death matches were sometimes mandated for specific occasions or as punishment for gladiators who had committed offenses, transforming the arena from a test of skill into an execution ground where no amount of bravery could earn survival. Now, let your thoughts drift to the Naumachii, the elaborate mock naval battles that represented the absolute pinnacle of Roman spectacle engineering. These staged sea battles required flooding entire arenas or excavating massive artificial basins that could be filled with water to depth sufficient for warships to maneuver. Julius Caesar staged the first recorded Naumachia in 46 BC in a specially constructed basin near the Tiber River, featuring 2,000 combatants and 1,000 crew members fighting aboard full-scale warships. Emperor Claudius later staged an enormous Naumachia on the Fucine Lake in 52 AD, involving 19,000 fighters, representing a battle between Sicilian and Rhodian fleets. These spectacles recreated famous historical naval battles, complete with ships, tactics, and the mass slaughter of prisoners of war and condemned criminals who were forced to fight to the death on the water. Some evidence suggests the Colosseum itself could be flooded for smaller Naumachii, though the logistics of doing so with the completed hypogeum beneath the arena floor remain a subject of scholarly debate. Breathe slowly and picture the female gladiators, who existed despite being far less common than their male counterparts. These women, called gladiatrices or gladiatrix in singular form, fought in the arena and scandalized Roman society even more than male gladiators. Women from wealthy families who volunteered to fight were seen as particularly shameful, abandoning feminine virtue for masculine violence and public display. Nevertheless, historical records document their existence. The historian Tacitus mentions women of senatorial rank performing in the arena during Nero's reign, while Suetonius records that Emperor Domitian staged fights between women at night by torchlight. An elaborate marble relief found at Halicarnassus, modern Turkey, depicts two female gladiators, Amazonia and Achillea, both shown wearing the same equipment as male fighters and given the rare honor of being released from their bout with a draw. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus banned women from arena combat, suggesting the practice had become common enough to require prohibition, though enforcement of this ban is questionable. Let yourself relax as we explore the bestiarii, the specialized fighters who battled wild animals in the morning venations that preceded the main gladiatorial contests. These animal fighters occupied a different social position than gladiators. They were considered even lower in status, lacking the training and prestige of true gladiators. Some bestiarii were condemned criminals forced to face animals with minimal weapons as a form of execution, but others were professional hunters who trained specifically for animal combat and were celebrated for their skill. The animals they faced represented the entire breadth of Rome's far-reaching empire: African lions and leopards, Asian tigers, European bears and bulls, crocodiles from Egypt, and even more exotic creatures like ostriches, which were hunted for sport and spectacle. The slaughter was immense. At the games celebrating the opening of the Colosseum, 9,000 animals were killed over 100 days. Emperor Trajan's games celebrating his Dacian victory in 107 AD reportedly killed 11,000 animals. This wholesale slaughter for entertainment contributed to the extinction or regional disappearance of several species across the Roman world. Now, breathe deeply and contemplate the Lanisti, the businessmen who owned and operated gladiator schools. These men occupied an interesting position in Roman society. They were often quite wealthy from their profitable enterprises, yet they were despised and legally classified as infames, alongside gladiators, pimps, and actors, meaning they could not hold public office or testify in court. A successful lanista needed to be part trainer, part businessman, and part showman. He purchased slaves with potential, hired skilled trainers to develop them, paid for medical care, and negotiated contracts with wealthy Romans and emperors who wanted to sponsor games. The lanista's goal was to create gladiators skilled enough to win and survive, thus increasing in value, while also spectacular enough to draw crowds and command high appearance fees. Some lanisti became very wealthy, though their wealth could never translate into social respectability. The most famous lanista was probably Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, in whose school in Capua the gladiator Spartacus trained before leading his famous revolt. Let your mind drift to the various forms of arena entertainment beyond standard gladiatorial combat. And debate were gladiators who fought while wearing helmets with no eye holes, effectively blind, stumbling around the arena swinging weapons at sounds and shadows while the crowd laughed at their confused combat. Pegniarii were comedic fighters who used whips and padded weapons to stage mock battles that parroted real gladiatorial combat, serving as lighter entertainment between more serious contests. Meridiani were inferior gladiators who fought at midday when many spectators had left for lunch, their combats less skilled and more brutal than the afternoon's main events. Some games featured novelty acts like dwarfs fighting each other or fighting women, displays that Romans found amusing but that modern sensibilities recognize as cruel exploitation. These variations demonstrate how the arena served multiple entertainment purposes simultaneously: tragic drama in the serious gladiatorial combats, comedy in the mock battles, horror in the executions and beast fights, creating a kind of variety show built around violence and death. Breathe slowly as we explore how gladiatorial combat was ritualized and governed by rules that distinguished it from simple murder. Referees called summa ludus and secunda ludus supervised fights, enforcing rules with a long staff they would use to separate fighters if necessary. Gladiators were matched by experience level and fighting style according to established traditions. A heavily armed murmillo would typically face a lightly armed but mobile retiarius, creating tactical variety. Fights could be stopped if one fighter suffered certain injuries, or if the combat was deemed too one-sided. The referee would determine if a fighter had legitimately submitted or was simply exhausted, protecting gladiators from being killed when they could still recover to fight again. This structure meant that gladiatorial combat, despite its violence, was more sport than slaughter, more about skill and spectacle than simple killing. Mortality rates in the arena, while difficult to determine precisely from historical records, were probably lower than commonly assumed, perhaps one death per 5 to 10 fights, with many gladiators surviving multiple bouts before eventually falling. The training weapons used in gladiator schools were deliberately heavier than actual combat weapons, a technique designed to build strength and ensure that real weapons would feel light and fast by comparison. Trainees practiced with wooden swords weighing twice what a real gladius weighed, shields heavier than their combat equivalents, and weighted training armor. They spent hours striking at paulus, wooden posts planted firmly in the ground, practicing specific cuts, thrusts, and defensive movements until they became automatic. This training was methodical and specific, with instructors teaching precise techniques for each gladiator type. A retiarius learned how to cast and retrieve his net, how to maintain distance with his trident, and how to use his mobility against armored opponents. A murmillo learned shield work, how to advance behind his large rectangular scutum, and how to use short, efficient sword strokes. The emphasis was on economy of movement, on not wasting energy in flashy but ineffective attacks, on waiting for openings and exploiting them with lethal precision. This professional approach to combat training influenced later military and martial traditions and demonstrates that despite the entertainment aspect, gladiatorial combat was a serious and studied art. As you rest in deep tranquility, imagine the training yards of the ludus, the rhythmic striking of wooden swords against wooden posts, the grunts of exertion, the shouts of instructors, men preparing for the moment when they would walk into the arena before thousands of screaming Romans, where all that training would be tested against an opponent equally skilled, equally desperate, equally trained to kill. Let your breathing slow as we explore the elaborate staging and theatricality that accompany gladiatorial games, for these were not simply fights, but carefully orchestrated performances. The games would begin with a pompa, a ceremonial procession through the streets of Rome featuring musicians playing horns and trumpets, dancers, priests carrying images of the gods, and the gladiators themselves paraded in elaborate costumes. When they reached the arena, the procession would circle the sand while the crowd cheered and evaluated the fighters they saw. The pompa served to build anticipation, to sanctify the games with religious ritual, and to display the wealth and generosity of the sponsor. Once in the arena, gladiators might perform mock combat demonstrations with wooden weapons to showcase their skills before the real fighting began. Between bouts, musicians would play, and attendants would rake the blood-soaked sand smooth and cover the worst stains with fresh sand, maintaining the arena's appearance even as bodies were dragged away through the Porta Libidinensis, the Gate of Libitina, named after the Roman goddess of funerals. Now, let your thoughts drift to the armor and equipment of gladiators, which was expensive, elaborately decorated, and designed as much for visual impact as for protection. A Murmillo's helmet might weigh 15 pounds and feature intricate relief decoration depicting mythological scenes, with a distinctive tall crest that made him appear larger and more impressive. The metal was often tinned or silvered to gleam in the sunlight. Greaves, shin guards, were often elaborately engraved with patterns and images. Shields bore painted designs and could be covered in leather or linen. The care and expense lavished on this equipment reflected its dual purpose. It had to protect the gladiator while also creating a spectacular visual display that justified the high prices Romans paid to sponsor or attend the games. After a gladiator's career ended, either through retirement or death, his armor would be cleaned, repaired if necessary, and passed on to the next fighter, who would wear the same helmet and carry the same shield that had protected his predecessors, each piece of equipment carrying the history of all who had worn it before. Breathe deeply and picture the gladiator cemeteries that have been discovered by archaeologists, providing tangible evidence of these men's lives and deaths. The most significant was found in Ephesus in modern Turkey, containing the remains of 67 individuals identified as gladiators through their distinctive injuries and the context of their burial. Analysis of these skeletons reveals the brutal reality of arena combat, multiple healed fractures showing they survived previous fights, evidence of amputations suggesting advanced medical treatment, and patterns of trauma indicating different gladiator types received different characteristic injuries. The killing wounds that ended their lives were often clean strikes to vital areas, suggesting the final blow was delivered professionally by a fellow gladiator rather than by wild animals or in chaotic combat. Some gladiators were buried with offerings, small tokens, oil lamps, coins, suggesting that despite their low social status, someone cared enough to honor them in death. These burials provide a poignant counterpoint to the glory and spectacle of the games, reminding us that behind the entertainment were real men who suffered and died. Let yourself relax as we explore the phenomenon of the bustuarii, a specific type of funeral combat that predated and coexisted with gladiatorial games. The term comes from bustum, meaning funeral pyre, and referred to combatants who fought specifically at funeral ceremonies, their blood serving as offerings to the deceased. This practice connected directly to the Etruscan origins of gladiatorial combat and maintained religious significance even as the games became more secular entertainment. In some bustuarii combats, one fighter might be specially designated to represent the deceased, fighting on behalf of the dead person's spirit. These funeral games could be elaborate affairs. When Publius Licinius Crassus died in 183 BC, his son staged games featuring 120 gladiators fighting over 3 days as part of the funeral rites. The bustuarii tradition gradually merged with and was superseded by the larger gladiatorial spectacles, but remained an element of aristocratic funerals for centuries, maintaining the link between combat and commemoration of the dead. Now breathe slowly and contemplate the primus paulus, the designation given to the highest-ranked gladiator in a ludus. This title, meaning first pole, in reference to the training post, marked a fighter who had achieved elite status through repeated victories and exceptional skill. A primus paulus commanded respect from other gladiators, received better treatment, sometimes at private quarters rather than a cell, and could charge higher fees for appearances. These elite fighters were valuable commodities, and their owners would be reluctant to risk them in unfavorable matchups. A lanista might loan out a primus paulus for games in other cities, earning substantial fees, while the gladiator gained fame across the empire. Some primus paulus gladiators became so renowned that their names were known throughout the Roman world, and they could effectively negotiate the terms of their fights, choosing opponents and insisting on favorable conditions. This hierarchy within the gladiatorial system created incentives for excellence and gave fighters something to strive for beyond mere survival. Let your mind drift to the role of gladiatorial games in Roman military culture and training. Roman soldiers, particularly during the imperial period, would often train using gladiatorial techniques, and gladiators were sometimes employed to teach legionaries combat skills. The Roman historian Vegetius, writing about military training, specifically mentions that soldiers should practice against training posts in the manner of gladiators, learning to fight with shield and sword through the same drills that ludus instructors taught. Some emperors, recognizing this connection, established schools where soldiers could train with gladiatorial weapons and techniques. The relationship worked both ways. Soldiers who were captured by Rome's enemies or who committed military crimes might be condemned to the arena, bringing their military training into gladiatorial combat. This cross-pollination between military and arena fighting meant that Roman martial culture was influenced by gladiatorial combat styles, with the efficient, brutal techniques proven in the arena finding their way onto the battlefield. Breathe deeply as we explore the emperors who participated in gladiatorial combat, or claimed to. The most notorious was Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 AD and became obsessed with gladiatorial fighting. He fought in the arena numerous times, though always under carefully controlled conditions that ensured his safety. He would face opponents who were given dulled or wooden weapons while he wielded real ones, or he would fight wounded or exhausted gladiators who could offer no real resistance. Commodus dressed as Hercules and believed he was the god's reincarnation, fighting as a secular gladiator and claiming hundreds of victories. He even renamed Rome after himself and performed in the Colosseum before the entire city, scandalizing the Senate and upper classes who saw such behavior as beneath imperial dignity. Historical sources suggest he planned to be inaugurated as consul while dressed in gladiator armor, but he was assassinated before he could carry out this plan. His obsession with the arena wasn't unique. Caligula, Titus, Hadrian, and other emperors participated in arena games, though most did so in private performances rather than public spectacles, understanding that while Romans loved gladiators, they expected their emperors to maintain certain standards of dignity. The concept of the gladiator as both villain and hero in Roman cultural consciousness created fascinating tensions in Roman art and literature. Poets wrote about gladiators with a mixture of contempt and admiration. Martial's epigrams describe individual fighters and their prowess, while also mocking their low status. Juvenal criticizes aristocratic women who lust after gladiators, using them as examples of moral decay. Yet, the same culture produced beautiful mosaics depicting named gladiators in action, commemorative cups and lamps decorated with gladiatorial scenes, and children's toys in the shape of gladiators. Gladiators appeared in Roman dreams. Dream interpretation manuals suggested that dreaming of gladiators could symbolize conflict, courage, or impending danger depending on the context. They featured in Roman curses and binding spells, where the names of victorious gladiators might be invoked for magical purposes. This cultural presence demonstrates that gladiators occupied a unique psychological space in the Roman mind, simultaneously fascinating and repelling, embodying both everything Rome valued: courage, martial skill, willingness to face death, and everything it despised: loss of freedom, low social status, fighting for entertainment rather than for country or glory. As you sink into deeper rest, picture the complex legacy of the gladiator, simultaneously slave and celebrity, victim and warrior, entertainment and sacrifice, man who lived at the intersection of so many Roman contradictions, whose blood watered the sand of countless arenas, whose names were carved in stone and written on walls, whose lives were brutal and short, yet somehow touched something essential in the Roman spirit. Let your breathing deepen as we explore the Dimachus, a rare and spectacular type of gladiator who fought with two swords simultaneously, one in each hand. The name comes from the Greek words di, meaning two, and machera, meaning sword. These fighters wore minimal armor, typically just padding on their arms and legs and a simple helmet, relying entirely on speed, agility, and their ability to attack and defend with both weapons at once. The Dimachus was considered one of the most skilled and difficult fighting styles to master, requiring years of training to develop the coordination necessary to wield two blades effectively. They were relatively rare in the arena, making their appearances special events that drew particular excitement from crowds. The Dimachus represents the diversity of gladiatorial combat. The Romans constantly sought new variations and spectacles, new ways to combine weapons and tactics, creating a taxonomy of fighting styles that could be mixed and matched to create endless combinations of matchups. Now, let your thoughts drift to the Esiderii, gladiators who fought from chariots in imitation of ancient British and Gallic warriors. Julius Caesar first encountered chariot warfare during his invasions of Britain in 55 and 54 BC, and the Romans were sufficiently impressed by this exotic fighting style to incorporate it into arena entertainment. Esiderii would drive light two-wheeled chariots around the arena, sometimes fighting other chariot-mounted gladiators, other times dismounting to fight on foot after using the chariot for dramatic effect. These fighters needed skills beyond typical gladiatorial combat. They had to be accomplished charioteers, able to control horses while fighting, and adapt between mounted and dismounted combat. The Esiderii brought an element of speed and movement to arena fights that contrasted with the more static combat of heavily armored gladiators, and their battles recreated the exotic warfare of Rome's distant conquests, allowing Romans to see the fighting styles of the barbarians their legions had defeated. Breathe slowly and picture the provocator, a gladiator type that most closely resembled a Roman legionary in equipment and fighting style. The provocator wore a breastplate or chest protection, carried a rectangular shield similar to a legionary scutum, and fought with a gladius, the same sword used by Roman soldiers. They wore a distinctive helmet with a broad brim and no crest, with a visor that protected the face. Provocateurs typically fought only against other provocateurs, creating matchups that mirrored military combat more closely than any other gladiatorial pairing. This type may have been created to allow Romans to see fighting that resembled actual battlefield conditions, or perhaps to honor the military origins that many gladiators shared. The provocator's similarity to a legionary also served as a reminder that the discipline and skill Romans admired in their soldiers could be found in the arena as well, blurring the line between martial valor and entertainment. Let yourself relax as we explore the concept of missio, the granting of reprieve to a defeated gladiator. When a fighter was wounded or exhausted and could no longer continue, he would signal his submission by raising his index finger, a gesture called ad digitum. At this point, the decision of life or death rested with the editor, the sponsor of the games, who would gauge the crowd's reaction. The popular image of thumbs up or thumbs down is likely inaccurate. Ancient sources are unclear about the exact gestures, but some evidence suggests that a closed fist with thumb and side meant mercy, while an extended thumb pointed at the chest meant death. If missio was granted, the defeated gladiator would live to fight another day, though he left the arena in defeat. If death was decreed, he was expected to accept it with courage, offering his throat or chest to his opponent's blade without flinching. This moment of decision, the brief suspension between life and death while the crowd roared and the editor considered, was perhaps the most dramatic element of gladiatorial combat, the instant when fate hung in the balance. Now breathe deeply and contemplate the hoplomachus, a gladiator type equipped in the style of a Greek hoplite warrior. The hoplomachus carried a small round shield called a parmula, wore heavy padding or mail on his legs, and fought with a spear as his primary weapon, supplemented by a short sword. His helmet was typically plumed, echoing the appearance of Greek warriors from centuries past. The hoplomachus represented Rome's complex relationship with Greek culture. Romans simultaneously viewed Greeks as culturally superior and as a conquered, subordinate people. By featuring Greek fighting styles in the arena, Romans could celebrate and appropriate Greek martial traditions, while also demonstrating Roman supremacy, as these Greek-style fighters were typically slaves or criminals fighting for Roman entertainment. The hoplomachus was often matched against other gladiator types, particularly the murmillo or thraex, creating combats that symbolically reenacted Rome's historical conflicts with Greek and Hellenistic kingdoms. Let your mind drift to the phenomenon of gladiatorial graffiti found throughout the Roman world, but most abundantly in Pompeii, where the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD preserved countless inscriptions scratched or painted on walls. These graffiti provide an unfiltered glimpse into how ordinary Romans viewed gladiators. We find declarations of fandom. Celadus the Thracian makes all the girls sigh. We find fight results recorded. Pugnax from Nero's school fought 3 times, won 3 times. We find boasts. Marcus Attilius, a rookie, defeated Hilarus, a veteran of 14 fights. We find romantic graffiti. Crescens the netter of young girls by night. Some graffiti records entire game programs, listing all the matchups and their outcomes, serving as a kind of ancient sports reporting. This graffiti demonstrates how deeply gladiatorial combat penetrated Roman popular culture. It wasn't just entertainment for the arena, but a subject of constant discussion, debate, and fascination that spilled into everyday life. Breathe slowly as we explore the cadaverii, groups of gladiators who fought in teams rather than in individual combat. These mass battles, called gregarii or catervi, pitted teams of fighters against each other in chaotic melees that more closely resembled actual warfare than the carefully matched individual duels. These team battles might be organized along ethnic lines, Germans versus Gauls, for instance, or simply as two groups of gladiators fighting en masse. The categorii combats were less common than individual fights because they were more difficult to control and choreograph, and the simultaneous action made it harder for spectators to follow individual fighters' exploits. However, they provided spectacular displays of mass violence and allowed sponsors to showcase large numbers of gladiators at once. Some imperial games featured battles involving hundreds of fighters simultaneously, creating scenes of overwhelming carnage that pushed the boundaries of spectacle even by Roman standards. The relationship between gladiators and Roman law reveals fascinating contradictions in how these fighters were perceived and treated. Legally, gladiators occupied an extremely low status. They were infames, stripped of many legal rights, unable to marry legally, and their testimony in court was only admissible under torture. Yet simultaneously, gladiatorial contracts were complex legal documents that specified terms of service, conditions of combat, payment arrangements, and the circumstances under which freedom might be earned. These contracts were enforceable in court, meaning that despite their low status, gladiators had certain contractual rights that could be legally defended. Some contracts specified that a gladiator could not be forced to fight in a sine mission event, protecting him from death matches. Others guaranteed medical care or limited the number of fights per year. This legal framework created a paradoxical situation where gladiators were simultaneously property and contractual parties, both objects and subjects under Roman law, reflecting the broader Roman ambivalence about these fighters who were essential to Roman entertainment, but whose existence troubled Roman concepts of honor, citizenship, and dignity. As you rest in complete peace, imagine the final moments of a gladiator's career, whether it ends with the ludus granting freedom after years of survival, or with a final wound in the sand, the roar of the crowd fading, the bright sky dimming, and the knowledge that at least it's over, at least the fear and the waiting and the endless cycle of training and fighting has reached its conclusion, and whatever comes next, it cannot be worse than the uncertainty of not knowing if each fight will be your last. Let your breathing slow as we explore the decline of gladiatorial combat, a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries as Roman society transformed. The rise of Christianity played a significant role in turning public opinion against the games. Early Christian writers like Tertullian condemned the arena as a place of sin and bloodlust, incompatible with Christian values of mercy and the sanctity of life. As Christianity became first tolerated and then the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, pressure mounted to end gladiatorial combat. Emperor Constantine issued edicts in 325 AD limiting gladiatorial games. Though these restrictions were often ignored, the last recorded gladiatorial fight in Rome occurred in 404 AD, when a Christian monk named Telemachus allegedly jumped into the arena during a fight, attempting to separate the combatants, and was stoned to death by the outraged crowd. Emperor Honorius, shocked by this event, finally issued a decree abolishing gladiatorial combat throughout the empire. However, animal hunts and other arena spectacles continued for another century or more, suggesting Romans found it easier to give up watching men kill each other than to abandon arena entertainment entirely. Now, let your thoughts drift to the concept of the ruderius, a gladiator who had earned his freedom through the ludus, but chose to continue fighting. These men were no longer slaves or bound by contract, yet they returned to the arena voluntarily, drawn by various motivations: the substantial fees they could now command as free agents, the addiction to the fame and adrenaline of combat, or simply because the arena was the only life they knew. Rudierii were highly respected, having proven their skill through years of survival, and they could be selective about whom they fought and under what conditions. Some became trainers while still occasionally fighting, passing on their knowledge while supplementing their income with appearances in major games. The Rudiarius represents perhaps the ultimate paradox of the gladiatorial world, a man who had won the freedom that every slave dreamed of, yet who could not leave behind the bloody sand of the arena, returning again and again to the place where he had nearly died dozens of times. Breathe deeply and picture the Venetia fighters who specialized in different types of animal combat. The bestiarii we mentioned earlier were the most common, but there were specialists who focused on particular animals or types of performance. Venators were skilled hunters who tracked and killed animals using spears, bows, or other hunting weapons, demonstrating their prowess in what resembled a hunt more than a fight. Some performers specialized in taming or performing tricks with animals rather than killing them, training elephants to walk tightropes, teaching lions to retrieve objects, or displaying other trained animal behaviors that amazed crowds. The most prestigious animal fighters were those who faced the largest and most dangerous predators: lions, tigers, bears, in single combat. These men required different skills than traditional gladiators, needing to understand animal behavior, maintain distance while attacking vulnerable points, and avoid the slashing claws and crushing jaws of beasts that could kill with a single strike. The variety of animal combat demonstrated Rome's dominion over the natural world and provided a different kind of spectacle than human combat, though it was no less deadly for those who participated. Let yourself relax as we explore the economics of gladiatorial combat, for these games represented enormous financial investments and complex business operations. The cost of staging games could bankrupt ambitious politicians, purchasing or renting gladiators, acquiring exotic animals, building temporary seating or stages, providing food and entertainment between fights, and offering the sportuli, or gifts distributed to the audience, all required vast sums. A single trained gladiator might cost 100,000 sestertii or more, equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled worker. If that gladiator was killed in the arena, his owner had to be compensated for the loss. This created a tension between sponsors, who wanted spectacular deaths, and lanisti, who wanted to preserve their valuable investments. Some gladiators were so expensive that their contracts specified that if they died, the sponsor must pay double or triple their value to compensate the owner. These financial considerations meant that despite the bloodthirsty reputation of the games, practical economics often favored keeping gladiators alive, turning the arena into a carefully calculated risk rather than a simple slaughterhouse. Now breathe slowly and contemplate the munus legitimum, the traditional and most respected form of gladiatorial games that followed established customs and rules. These games were distinguished from munera extraordinaria, special games that might feature unusual matchups, exotic fighters, or novelty acts. A munus legitimum featured proper pairings of gladiator types according to tradition: Murmillo versus Retiarius, Hoplomachus versus Thraex, with fighters matched by experience and skill level. The program would follow the traditional sequence of morning animal hunts, midday executions, and afternoon gladiatorial contests. The editor would observe proper protocols, The referees would enforce the rules strictly, and the defeated would be granted missio or death according to established precedents and crowd sentiment. These traditional games represented gladiatorial combat at its most honorable, if such a word can apply to mortal combat for entertainment. The existence of this distinction shows that even within the brutal world of the arena, Romans recognized gradations of propriety and tradition, with some ways of conducting games considered more legitimate and respectable than others. Let your mind drift to the famous gladiator schools beyond Rome, for while the ludus magnus was the most prestigious, major cities throughout the empire maintained their own training facilities. Capua, where Spartacus launched his rebellion, was particularly famous for its gladiator schools and produced many renowned fighters. Pompeii had its own gladiatorial barracks, and the city was passionate about the games. Graffiti suggests that gladiatorial fandom was a major part of Pompeian social life. Alexandria in Egypt, Carthage in North Africa, and numerous cities in Gaul, Spain, and the eastern provinces all had facilities for training and housing gladiators. These provincial schools fed fighters into the smaller amphitheaters scattered across the empire, where local games entertained regional audiences who might never travel to Rome, but who were no less enthusiastic about gladiatorial combat. The geographic spread of gladiator schools demonstrates how thoroughly this form of entertainment had penetrated Roman culture, becoming not just a phenomenon of the capital, but a defining feature of Roman civilization from Britain to Syria, from Spain to the Black Sea. Breathe deeply as we explore the concept of the octoritus, the legal status of the free man who voluntarily became a gladiator. When a free Roman signed a gladiatorial contract, he underwent a transformation that Roman society found deeply troubling. He swore the sacramentum gladiatorum, voluntarily accepting the same conditions as a slave. He could be beaten, branded, chained, and killed. He surrendered his legal rights and became infamous in the eyes of the law. Yet unlike a slave, he did this by choice, and he typically received substantial upfront payment for surrendering his freedom for a specified period, usually 3 to 5 years. Some octor were desperate men escaping debt or poverty, selling themselves into temporary slavery for immediate money. Others were thrill seekers or men who believed their combat skills would make them rich and famous. A few were patricians or even senators who, despite laws forbidding upper-class participation in the arena, were drawn to gladiatorial combat by some combination of rebellion, thrill-seeking, or psychological compulsion. The octoritus represented a voluntary descent into infamy, a choice that Roman society could neither fully understand nor entirely condemn, since the willingness to face death for glory resonated with Roman martial values, even when the context violated every notion of dignitas and honor. The final fact to contemplate as you drift into the deepest sleep concerns the legacy of gladiatorial combat in Western culture and imagination. Though gladiatorial games ended over 1,500 years ago, they continue to fascinate modern audiences, appearing in countless films, books, video games, and other media. We view gladiators through a complex lens, recognizing the brutality and injustice of forcing slaves to fight to the death, yet also drawn to the courage, skill, and defiance that some gladiators embodied. Modern sports, particularly combat sports like boxing and mixed martial arts, bear some resemblance to gladiatorial combat. Regulated violence performed for entertainment, with clear rules, weight classes, and expectations of sportsmanship that echo the structured nature of arena combat. The gladiator has become a symbol that can represent different things. The exploited victim of an oppressive system, the warrior who refuses to surrender despite impossible odds, the entertainer who risks everything for glory, or the rebel who turns the weapons given him by his masters against the system itself. This enduring fascination suggests that gladiatorial combat, for all its strangeness to modern sensibilities, touched on something fundamental about human nature: our relationship with violence, our need for heroes, our attraction to spectacle, and our endless fascination with those who face death with courage and skill, whether in ancient Roman arenas or in the stories we continue to tell about them today. As you rest in the deepest tranquility, let the world of the gladiators fade into history, the roar of crowds silenced, the arenas crumbling to ruins, the blood long washed away by time and rain, leaving only the stories, the scattered bones and forgotten graves, the graffiti on Pompeian walls, and the eternal question of what we would do, how we would face that moment when the gate opens and we must walk into the arena, into the light and noise and sand, knowing that everything, life, death, glory, and oblivion, awaits in the next few minutes, and that courage or cowardice, skill or clumsiness, will determine which we meet.